So, good evening, everyone. I'm Roger Mosey, the Master of Selwyn College, and I'd like to welcome you here tonight to this year's Ramsay Murray Lecture. It's being held in person at the Quarry Whitehouse Auditorium in the college, and here with us we have an audience of Selwynites, including some current students and fellows, people from other colleges, members of the public, and distinguished academic visitors. Of those academics, one of my colleagues said earlier, it has ended up being rather like a Cambridge History Faculty away day, but we are delighted you're here. And our audience in Grange Road is supplemented virtually on YouTube by some hundreds of people joining us online, and you are all very welcome indeed. Now, the Ramsay Murray Lecture is the latest in a series that we owe to the generous bequest of Lt Col Alexander Ramsay Murray, a loyal alumnus. And his brief for these lectures was agreeably broad in that they should be on a subject of military or historical or general interest, which we have been known to note gives us quite a lot of choice. And it does, most of all, encourage us to take a broader view of issues. So we consider here the biggest themes, and we leave aside the demands on our time from breaking news headlines of today, such as where will Prince Harry sit in the Abbey tomorrow? Now, in recent years in this lecture, we have been on something of a world tour. Russia with Bridget Kendall, the United States with Theda Skocpol, the Middle East with Frank Gardner, China with Rana Mitter. So it is quite understandable that we should turn our attention to Germany, though at this point there is a shift worthy of Doctor Who in that we're going back 5 centuries to look at the Peasants' Wars. But I think we will find that they do have greater resonance than simply being a piece of medieval history. And we are delighted to welcome our lecturer, Professor Lyndal Roper, to Selwyn. She is the Regius Professor of History at Oxford and has chalked up some notable firsts. The first woman to hold that Regius chair and the first Australian. She's a Fellow of the British Academy, a Fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities, and a Fellow of the Brandenburg Academie der Wissenschaften. Her research and her publications have ranged from Martin Luther to witches. Professor Roper is going to speak for just under an hour, and then there'll be a chance for people here in the auditorium to ask questions. And my colleague, Dr. Mike Sewell, will take over at that point as Master of Ceremonies, thus allowing historian to speak unto historian, though questions are welcome from everyone. Professor Roper.
Thank you very much indeed, Roger, and thanks also to the college and to David and Mike for inviting me. It's a great honour to be asked to give this lecture, and I hope that I will say something that even relates to military history, and those who know me will be astonished, as indeed I am myself. So thank you very much. It's also wonderful to see so many friends and colleagues, and to be reminded of how much I owe this academic community, which has inspired me and from whom I've learnt so much. And we were just talking earlier, David and I, about Bob Scribner, who was my supervisor, and although I wasn't a student at Cambridge, I felt that I owed a huge amount to him, and I know how important Cambridge was to him. So thinking about tonight and thinking about what one does with a lecture like this also made me think about how history and the historical profession have changed since I was a student. So I'm grateful for that. And it's made me think about what we study, what we remember, how we remember, and why we do. So I want to start by asking, and here I'm going to beg you to be honest, and those on YouTube, I'll look and see if you raise your hands. How many of you tonight have ever heard of the German Peasants' War? And I mean, heard of it before you decided to come to the lecture. Not everyone has, and usually when I say to people, I'm working on the German Peasants' War, total blankness is the response, and very quickly they turn away. So if I asked you how many people have heard of Martin Luther, how many would that be? Well, it's a very different answer. And that is because the Peasants' War is largely forgotten. The last major history of it was written in the 1990s, the last new interpretation in 1981, over a generation ago. And funnily enough, David was talking about the tutorial that he had with Bob Scribner, which was on the Peasants' War, and it would have been in 1983. But I don't think that's what you would probably find now. So much has changed since then. Germany has been reunited and is unrecognisable, and we all write history very differently from how we did it then. So, why should you care? Well, I think you should care for two reasons. And the first one is, it's really big. Perhaps as many as 100,000 people were killed in the space of 3 months from late April to the end of June 1525. So in the areas in which the battles took place, it was a month of overwhelming bloodshed. Even the lowest figures estimate over 20,000 for Württemberg and Franconia alone. So what is that? Well, 100,000 is approaching 2% of the male population of the region of what we might call Germany at the time. And in the areas of the war itself, that proportion will have been much higher. By comparison, in World War I, just under 2% of the whole population in Britain died. But that was over a period of 4 years. Nobody doubts the trauma that World War I left behind that we're still processing today. So in scale, the Peasants' War is on a par. And for a period roughly from April to June, the peasants were in control. There was a complete collapse of authority that spread like a tsunami from place to place, so much so that in some areas the rebels set up governmental structures of their own. And they held parallel peasants' councils that met next door to council chambers. They set up chancelleries with their own seals. Many officials and lower nobility simply went over to the peasants as the system of rule collapsed. The entire political landscape was upended. So the war left a huge trauma in its wake, in blood, memory, politics, and religion. So the second reason why you should care is that it happened in the middle of the Reformation, and it matters because it changed the Reformation in Germany forever. So those of us who've heard of the Peasants' War all know one side of the story. The Peasants' War makes Luther more conservative. He comes out on the side of the princes and repression, and from then on, the Reformation is on the side of the authorities. But the other side of the story, the side we've forgotten, is there was a radical populist Reformation that linked religious to social and political change. This radical Reformation was obliterated and forgotten. The preachers who led it were summarily executed, and often they're executed so fast that they're not even interrogated, so we don't have the interrogations to know what they believed. We think that we know the theology and ideas of preachers like Thomas Müntzer, Balthasar Hubmaier, and Andreas Karlstadt, because they all got their work into print. But we don't even have their words for this period. We don't know exactly what Hubmaier or Karlstadt were preaching in 1525, and we only have Müntzer's frantic letters, not his sermons in the final days. But these more famous figures are not representative of the many preachers and priests who fought in the war. There are scores of other preachers who never got into print, but who inspired people to risk their lives on the battlefield. This is a lost Reformation, one we don't even know. So I think looking back, I would say that as we forgot about the Peasants' War, that profoundly distorted our picture of the Reformation. From the very outset, Lutheran historiography turned it into a battle between two men, Luther and Münzer, who saw Münzer as the devil of Mulhausen. He refused to take it seriously as a wide peasant movement with serious grievances. Those rebels who survived wanted to forget, and they had to distance themselves from it if they were to avoid punishment. But without the war, we don't have a real picture of the Reformation. So just to sort of sum that up, the Reformation in German lands was an event with a trauma in the middle, an event of blood in which perhaps 2% of the male population were killed within 10 weeks. Or to put it another way, and I've just been thinking about how I represent this, the Reformation was a kind of a donut event. And the Peasants' War is the unspeakable hole in the middle that is never related to the Reformation around it. But unless we see that hole, we can't see the Reformation's shape. So, as I was thinking about this, I was thinking that for the past 30 years that I've taught history at university, historians, I would say, have been mainly interested in the growth of the state and in continuity. And I know that's a gross oversimplification, but perhaps you recognise something in that. And by contrast, again grossly oversimplifying, the generation before mine, that of Christopher Hill, Georges Roudet, Eric Hobsbawm, and before them Marx and Engels, were interested in revolt and revolution, in moments of rupture. So I've thought it's been time to return to the subjects that they made their own, but to bring a new generation's questions to them. So talking to you tonight has forced me to ask why I should make you care about the Peasants' War, what it has to tell us today, and how and why it's different from other revolutions. But I can't tell you the whole story this evening. Instead, what I'm going to do is just talk about 3 features of it. So first I'm going to talk about its targets, then about the masculinism of the revolt, and finally about landscape. And these are very much thoughts as I'm writing a book. They're things I want to try out, and I'm very interested to see what your responses to this will be. So, first, you can tell a lot from what a movement attacks. When the French Revolution began, the rebels marched to the Bastille to free the prisoners because the Bastille symbolized royal power and its arbitrary cruelty. When the Russian Revolution began, people took to the streets of St. Petersburg. In 2021 in the US, crowds attacked the Capitol. What were the peasants' targets? Well, they attacked monasteries and convents. And I think one of the many things that we've forgotten about the Peasants' War is that it started with a huge destruction of monasteries and convents. Louisa Bergolt, Ed Wareham and I have been reconstructing all the ecclesiastical institutions that existed in the German lands at this time to try and get a handle on the extent of what happened. And we've found that 349 institutions were attacked. And here's a map showing them. It's completely incomprehensible, isn't it? It's got different colours for each of the orders. It's a vast number, and it amounts to about 30% of monastic institutions in the area of the war. 209 monasteries and 140 convents. So if you look at the proportions, it's slightly higher for convents. It's about 33% of them were attacked. And for monasteries, it's probably just shy of 28% of them. So to show you what that means, this map zooms in on one area between Nuremberg down the bottom and going up to Würzburg. And it shows, and what we show here are the red institutions that are the ones that are attacked. And the blue are the ones that weren't attacked in this area. So, in particular, we found that the peasants went for the rich orders. They went for the Benedictines, the Premonstratensians, the female Dominicans, and they didn't go for the Franciscans. They also went for the military orders, the Teutonic Knights and the Knights of St. John, which were deeply hated. And they attacked pilgrimage sites associated with the monasteries. So in a really kind of odd way, you could view the war as a sort of massive anti-pilgrimage, because it goes to many of the same places. And it goes along some of the same routes that pilgrims would have gone, and to the same places. So these people hated monasticism. They hated the power that monasteries and abbeys exercised as lords. In the southwest, abbots were amongst the worst lords, the ones insisting on serfdom and controlling marriage, the ones restricting freedom the most. They wouldn't let you marry someone who was the subject of another lord or who was even free, unless you paid swingeing fines. They lent money so that many were indebted to them. They insisted on feudal dues and made people undertake humiliating labour at busy times of year, like harvest time. And I think this is so interesting because it's the opposite of our usual picture of monasticism. Charitable institutions that cared for the poor and the sick, that provided priests and confessors, that fed and housed travellers and pilgrims. So for those of you who work on English history, would this kind of attack on monasticism be imaginable? In the Holy Roman Empire, political, social, and religious power were intertwined because bishops were often territorial rulers as well, and so were abbots, and they had their own fortified castles in many cases. So the Bishop of Würzburg, and there's his castle, ruled a vast swathe of Franconia. The abbot of Fulda was a prince as well as an abbot with his territory. Monasteries like Salem or Schöntal had territories they governed. And they all came from the same ruling families as the dukes, counts, and princes. So when the peasants finally caught up with the abbot of Kempten in his favourite castle, Liebenthal, they confiscated 30,000 gulden worth of cash, silver, and jewels. Next, they made him undress, and another 500 gulden dropped out of his clothes. They left him with 300 gulden, sat him on an ass, and sent him packing back to Kempten with a single servant. So we're used to thinking of the iconoclasm of the Calvinist Reformation as a massive loss, a destruction of superb art. But not everything old is great, and destruction, I think, also creates space. Smashing monasteries, taking their grain stores, drinking their cellars dry, and purloining the sacred objects like chalices and vestments, things that a peasant congregation could barely see, let alone take home with them, is iconoclasm writ large. It destroyed the power of objects in the sacred and loosened the grip of monastic religiosity on people's minds. And it altered the landscape too, as the rebels set fire to the monasteries that had punctuated the landscape, centres of culture, libraries, and of course, of power. monasteries were centres of wealth. By seizing a monastery's food and drink, the peasant armies were able to supply themselves, something which previous rebels had found hard to do, and which was essential to keep the movement going. Soldiers who are well fed on barbecued meat and can drink their fill are happy soldiers who can keep marching and fighting for longer. They hope to win booty too. They can also stay in one place while the supplies flow. And so several monasteries, like Schöntal or Bilthausen, became peasant headquarters. The monastery's valuables and vestments could be converted to cash, which could be used to buy weapons, and this made the peasant armies serious forces. The Teutonic Knights also had stores of weapons, which the peasants were able to seize. They captured one of their main castles near Heilbronn, Castle Horneck, with its arms before burning it down. Indeed, I've started to think that one reason why the Peasants' War was so successful was because it was financed by monastic plunder and supplies. No previous and no subsequent pre-modern revolt in that area managed to secure such a source of wealth or arm itself as effectively. In monastic histories, the Peasants' War is treated as a blip, as a moment from which monasteries quickly recovered as the Counter-Reformation followed in the second half of the century. And it's as if this outpouring of anger and hatred of monasticism had never happened. This chronicle, which is a wonderful chronicle, which was commissioned by the Abbot of Weissenau and shows in visual terms what happens, shows what it was like. So the peasants sat where the abbot sat. They guzzled the monastery beer, they fished out the ponds, and they treated the monks with contempt. So just to show you some detail here, there they are, fishing out the ponds. I think it's so fascinating because there's clearly an issue about ponds, because everywhere that's what the peasants do. They fish them out and they remove the dams that keep the fish in. And so there's a lot of anger about fish. Sometimes they have parties, they all turn up, the women as well, and they just fish the whole thing out. And it means, of course, there's no future supplies. That's the end of it. And here you can see two peasants fighting. This is the abbot's chronicle. So he's showing that the peasants are fighting each other, and someone is saying peace, trying to stop them from being so violent. And you can see the blood here with the wounds. And there, that's in the refectory, and a peasant has taken the abbot's place. And you can see the turning of the world upside down that is involved. And here are a couple of peasants who've had rather too much monastic beer. In other accounts, we read of monks being hunted out of their cells and made to jump over the walls. And even priests were occasionally subject to what is termed the Herrenstrick, the gentleman's rope, which is a rope pulled backwards and forwards through the buttocks, painful and sexually humiliating. But what's so striking at that time is how little authorities of any kind did to protect the monasteries, nor did local people do anything to help them either, or to stop them being looted. I haven't come across a case of that happening so far. The sheer hatred of monks, priests and nuns, the lack of respect for them, is breathtaking and suggests that the Reformation had precipitated a collapse of the monastic ideal. It legitimated a ruthless anti-monasticism. Cruel caricatures of monks are everywhere in Reformation polemic, and some satires presented monks not just as figures of fun, but as subhuman. And here are some that I've been really interested just recently in. These ones come from Heilbronn, and this tower was finished in 1529 by a master mason who supported the Reformation and even depicted himself. I'll show you in a minute. And you can see that extraordinary caricature on the right. And there's another one and a different version of it. And you can see, remember that tower I showed you? Well, just there you can see some of the, can you see some of the caricatures of, there's one there, and there's another one you can just make out there. And this whole tower is just an extraordinary thing, and I would love to be able to get up there and have a good look at it. There's actually there, can you see that winding spiral staircase? Extraordinary. And there's a Landsknecht, a German mercenary, at the top of it. What does that mean? Why is he at the top of a spiral staircase, which, as you can see, there, can you see where that is? Just extraordinary. And where the designer of the tower has put his own portrait is at the bottom of that spiral staircase. Just amazing. There he is, Hans Schweiner. Just, I think it's one of the things that I found most interesting in working on this is how many, well, I would term them hidden monuments to the Peasants' War. This is 1529, 4 years after Heilbronn has gone through an absolutely traumatic event, being part of the war. And I think you can see some of the legacies of that in that tower. The hatred of monks and nuns, the whatever he's trying to say about German mercenaries, who in the end are the ones who put down the Peasants' War, and what he's trying to say about civic identity by putting all that in this new tower, which is the most striking thing about that church. Absolutely amazing. And I've come across so many hidden monuments of that kind. One where there's a Christopher who's holding the Christ child on his shoulder, and he's dressed in the clothes of an ordinary citizen, and the relationship between the Christ child and the man who's carrying the weight of the world, and the importance of secular authority being back where it should be, is just really striking in that, and that's put up straight after the Peasants' War. And there's an even more incredible one in Mainz, which I can go on and on about, because it's a monument in praise of the victory of Albrecht of Mainz over the peasants. So instead, what happens, instead of monasteries and convents being protected, terrified of what was going to happen, and of course many monastic institutions are situated in isolated rural areas. So what do? They flee to the towns, where they also often had property, or else they beg local authorities to defend them. But it's a risky strategy asking your local council or your local ruler to defend you, because what they want to do is use their advantage to force the monks and nuns to become citizens and pay tax. So if they get protection from a town council, as happened, for instance, in Heilbronn, the first thing the town or the prince would do was to demand that the property that they were going to look after for them should be inventoried. But as soon as you make an inventory, you make your wealth visible to that authority. There it was, for the taking. It could be turned into hospitals, schools, universities, and it could bail out princely coffers. So poor Sebastian von Breitenstein, who we met before fleeing his castle Liebenthal, had to seek asylum in the town of Kempton, and the council, seizing their chance, bought out all his rights over the town for 30,000 gulden, powers over the citizenry which he never recovered. And it's known as the Big Purchase, which gave the town its freedom, and it's still fabled today. Many of the monasteries which the peasants burnt down were never rebuilt, and in many of the regions which later joined the Reformation, this was the first phase of secularization, finding out what wealth these institutions had. The Peasants' War made a reconsideration of monasticism unavoidable. Monasticism had been attacked by Luther, and many monks had simply left, especially in orders like the Augustinians, though many were starting to backpedal, suggesting that not all monasticism was bad. And that happens quite fast. You see people doing that as early as 1523, 1524. But the Peasants' War was a final assault on their institutional status that changed monasticism on the ground by simply wiping much of it out. It was a new vision of what brotherhood should be. So the second thing I want to talk about, the second feature, is that this is a revolt without Mary. Before the modern era, many revolts in the European West used saints and religious figures to rally around and to sanctify their cause. Mary could be used by the authorities too. Many of us will remember Peter Burke's wonderful account of the Virgin of the Carmine in the Revolt of Masaniello, whose image was on the rebels' banners and which was also used by the other side to pacify the crowds. The Poor Conrad and the Bundschuh revolts, which preceded the Peasants' War, used papal and imperial insignia and had a banner which featured a peasant shoe next to John and Mary, beside Christ on the cross. Their flag depicted a male and a female peasant. But not the Peasants' War. The peasants didn't invoke Mary or any other saints, and their banners showed the cross, a rainbow, Christ, the peasant boot, but never a saint and never the Virgin. They were without exception Christocentric. Not only that, but many of the monasteries they attacked were also or had Marian shrines. So, for instance, Maria im Nesselbusch, Maria in the Nettelbusch, a Carthusian monastery, which is just outside Heilbronn. So it's sort of over in that left-hand back corner. And it had a miraculous image of Mary, which had been found in this Nettelbusch. Or Mallerbach, a Marian pilgrimage site owned by a convent near Allstedt. In one South German convent, the peasants simply chopped off Mary's head. Instead, the Peasants' War was a strongly masculine movement. Its watchword was brotherhood. Everyone addressed each other as brother, and the male peasant with his peasant boot was its hero, dressed in boots, jerkin, and hat with a dagger at his side. Every item of clothing, things which only men could wear. The movement was held together by oaths which only men could swear. Decisions were taken in the ring, outside, and women don't seem to have been included. Very few women are known to have been involved in the revolt. Remarkably, there were no references to saints or to Mary on the part of the rebels, and I find that extraordinary because they seem to have endorsed completely the Reformation stance against saints' cults, pilgrimages, and above all, they seem to have concurred with the downgrading of Mary from Queen of Heaven and intercessor with Christ to exemplar of Christian humility, a woman who shouldn't be prayed to. And so I'd like to speculate a little bit tonight about what that might tell us. What happens if you take Mary away? Mary is, as all feminists know, a complicated figure. So what I want to do is just raise a couple of questions. The work of Mary Rubin and Ruth Harris has shown us that Marianism can often sit alongside anti-Semitism. Attacks on synagogues often finish with a chapel to Mary being erected on the site of the synagogue. That's what happened at Regensburg and at Würzburg, to name just two. And in Regensburg in 1519, there was a pilgrimage to the miraculous image of Mary. This image of Altdorfer shows the synagogue, which was destroyed when the chapel to Mary was built. Here's his representation of the miraculous image, and here's Michael Offsendorfer's depiction of the pilgrimage with the ruins of the synagogue just visible on the right, and the pilgrims in ecstatic devotional poses. Why should this be? Well, it's a big question, and there are many people here tonight who can say much more about this than I can. But because Jews don't recognize Jesus as the Messiah, anti-Semitic Christians took this as an insult to Mary. If Jesus is not the Messiah, she is not the Mother of God, yet this alone is what her special status rests upon. On this logic, to deny Jesus is the Son of God is to denigrate Mary. Conversely, when Luther wrote his arguably pro-Jewish piece that Jesus Christ was born a Jew, and he writes that, that gets published in 1523. So it's just before the Peasants' War. And what does he do in that piece? He spends the first half of it defending himself against anti-Marianism. And for a long time I was puzzled over why would you do that? Why would you set it up that way? And I think this is why. So I was expecting to find a lot of anti-Semitism in the German Peasants' War, and there certainly is some. We know that it's a theme in the Upper Rhine and in Alsace, and usury was certainly an issue in the war, and anti-usury preaching can be and was anti-Semitic. We know that some Jewish houses were attacked in revolts in Austria. But we also find explicit statements allowing Jews to join peasant bands, albeit on condition that they have to give up usury and not be repaid full interest. But I think it is interesting that the Peasants' War happens at what in some ways is a sort of a slight high point, or perhaps one should say a lesser down point of anti-Semitism. It happens at a slight potential philo-Semitic moment when Luther has published that Jesus Christ was born a Jew. And that text is critical of anti-Semitism, pointing out that Christians prevent Jews from doing anything except lending money. And there are some very interesting participants in the war, such as Balthasar Hubmaier, a fascinating, interesting figure, who started out as an anti-Semitic preacher and supporter of that Marian pilgrimage to Regensburg. He was instrumental in supporting the shrine to her built on the ruins of the ghetto, and he gave up his attachment to the shrine and his Marianism when he became a radical preacher and peasant supporter and the contrast between Regensburg and Waldshut is just extraordinary. Waldshut, where he goes, is a really tiny town. And though he doesn't become pro-Semitic, he's not apparently as rabidly anti-Semitic as he had been. So it seems to me, but I might change my mind, but it seems to me at the moment that the German Peasants' War doesn't see the kind of extreme anti-Semitism which can be a bridge to popularism, even though anti-Semitic preaching is often anti-usury and pro the poor. And I wonder whether its absence is connected with the absence of Mary. Mary's also associated with idealizations of femininity and of splitting women into good mothers and virgins or bad, sexy women. And she can be a difficult ideal for women because we can't be both virgins and mothers. And so human femininity is always imperfect, always unable to square that circle. Femininity for humans is mired in sexuality. or for ordinary humans. It's always a bad identity because Mary is unattainable. So what does it mean for the German Peasant War that it has no place for Mary? And, you might add, not much place for women either. And here I just want to draw attention to three interesting features of the revolt. The peasant armies seem to have pretty much exclusively involved men. Women don't appear women do appear amongst those who plunder convents, monasteries and priests' houses. And women do act as fencers for stolen goods. But I found almost no examples of women in military bands. Perhaps because these bands, these sort of small fighting groups, which then join with others and become bigger and bigger and bigger, perhaps because they often start out as local communal assemblies, which women mostly weren't part of, they don't appear to have travelled with the menfolk as they joined ever larger military bands. They apparently stayed behind and kept farms going. By contrast, contemporary armies like that of the Swabian League or the military contingents who fought in Italy had large numbers of female camp followers who cooked, washed and generally made the work of the army possible. Interestingly, the peasant military ordinances ban women from their armies and insist on high moral standards. And when I first read this, I thought, oh yeah, here we go. It's the usual misogynist attitude towards women as prostitutes, where you blame the women for the men's behaviour. But now I'm starting to wonder whether these armies deliberately set out to be different, at least in theory, from that of the Swabian League or of their other enemies, excluding women and advertising their rectitude to their female kin, on whom they were probably having to depend to run the farms. And a second interesting feature is that after the war, the authorities reverted to the oldest gender stereotypes as they choreographed defeat. The women of the defeated towns processed as maidens and matrons, wearing wreaths, and they handed over the rebellious towns, asking for mercy. And that's something that Olinka Rublak drew attention to years ago in relation to the 30 Years' War. The women of Leipheim, in this case, were forced to wear the town symbol of the city of Ulm on their clothes to mark the fact that Leipheim was now subject to Ulm. And if you're wearing the badge of a town on your clothes, you look like a prostitute who sometimes had to wear distinctive civic badges on your clothes. Mostly, however, men and not women were punished. The wives of rebels were forced to say where their menfolk were, under threat of banishment and loss of the farm. In all the executions that followed as the revolt was put down, I haven't yet come across a single woman. It seems that the end of the war made women visible, but only in the most conservative versions of womanhood. By contrast, in the very few cases where women did take part in revolt, they were gender boundary crossers. For example, the Black Hofmännin, as she was known, blessed the peasants as if she were a priest. She led them, she had a dagger, she boasted that she had the fat of the skewered count on her shoes. So she boasted that she was one of the ones who killed this nobleman in one of the most notorious atrocities. She had said that they should, and this is what she was alleged to have said, that they should cut off the clothes of the stinking gracious ladies in front of their asses so that they should go about like plucked geese. This woman is a big mouth. Yet she wasn't punished because, and this is just so funny, her feudal lord petitioned on her behalf and got her off. Let me just... She wasn't punished, and the feudal lord argued that The female sex does not carry out its threats except with their mouths, and they have no effect with deeds. And that got her off. So this is a woman who's doing her best, I think, to be neither male nor female, to escape womanly ideals. And here is her statue in Buckingham by the artist Dieter Klump. And what is so fascinating is that this was erected in 1986, and then they built that block of flats behind, completely ruining the whole point of the statue, which was meant to look out across the fields and be outside the town hall and at a distance from the church. There was no memorial to this woman, even though she is the most famous woman in the German Peasants' War. And until he put that up, there was only a mention of Jäcklein Rohrbach, who was the peasant leader from that area and with whom she worked. But even to him, there was no statue, just his name on the back of a statue to one of the town's other notables who was involved in catching a fish that the Roman emperor had put back. And on the back of that statue, where you couldn't see it at all, Jäcklein Rohrbach was mentioned. So Klump doing that, I think, is very interesting. And here you can see that very powerful image of her. It's an extraordinary work of art. And you can see it still touches a raw nerve today. So, if I may, I'd finally like to just talk a bit about the experience of going back to the history of the German Peasants' War and what it's been like to research it, because I deliberately set out to make the landscape part of it, and I was inspired by the work of Matthew Kelly on Dartmoor and Paul Ward on forests and others to think about the environment. So I've tried to go to most of the places where the revolt happened. So I just want to talk about how that's changed me as a historian and how I think about things. So for instance, the final battle of the peasants, led by Thomas Münzer, took place at Frankenhausen. I don't know how many people have been to Frankenhausen. Who has? Great. Fantastic. And it wasn't until I cycled there from Mulhausen that I understood what happened. The battlefield is a high plateau, and you can see from miles in all directions. And what that means is that when you're up there, you can see the land that you're fighting for. It's spread out before you. The emblem on Münzer's flag was a rainbow, so when something like a rainbow appeared on the eve of battle, it must have been electrifying in that large sky. You've got a really large sky from that plateau. It must have seemed, as the men sang, "Come, Holy Spirit," that God had sent a sign, and they did all sing that hymn together. To get to the battlefield, you have to walk up steeply from the town of Frankenhausen with its salt pools and over the hill through the woods. Or if you approach from the other side, you have to scale a steep slope. Many of those who died were killed fleeing down the hill into town. There's a gully that is still today known as the Blutrinne, or the Blood Gully, that marks where their blood ran down. And I could go on and on and on about Frankenhausen, now the site of the Peasant War panorama by the East German artist Werner Tübke. That's just one small section of what is the biggest painting in the world at 14 metres high and 123 metres long, housed in that massive circular monument. See that? That's where that painting is. So it's quite a thing. It took 12 years to paint. It required a huge team of artists to do it. and it was opened in September 1989, just weeks before the East German regime, which had commissioned it, came to an end. But it is an absolutely fabulous painting, I think. Or if I can take another example, sorry? So I couldn't understand why at Bamberg the local peasantry and townsfolk supported the bishop, but not the cathedral chapter and the monks. So there's Bamberg. Bamberg is built on 7 hills, like a mini Rome. And like Rome, it's an ecclesiastical conglomerate. And this is reflected in the landscape. The clergy all lived high up on the hills that surround the town, including the cathedral clergy, who occupied a large and impressive set of buildings behind the cathedral and had land outside town. I can't convey to you what it's like on that. You just kind of have to take my word for it. But you can sort of see the hills and the monastic institutions dotted around. This gives you, I think, a slightly better, I'm sorry, it's fuzzy, it's the background of a painting from 1483. And I think you can see there how important height is. The townsfolk all lived down low, crammed into a small area of plain by the river. And even the town hall is built in nowhere land on the river itself. And then when I went there, I finally understood why they didn't trust the cathedral chapter and hated the monasteries, but were fine with the bishop. There are only 2 parish churches in the town, and yet there are stacks of churches for the nobility and the orders, one on every hill. Or to take another example, that of Kempton. And in Kempton, there are 2 parallel cities. On the left of the town on the left of there is the town, and on the right is the bishop's foundation. And the bishop's is on higher ground. And there are even different maps for his territory than for the town territory. And in the 18th century, Kempton Abbey even had its own separate system of apothecaries, and there's a map showing where all the abbot area apothecaries are. So that the way that you would have perceived Kempton is of 2 parallel places, really. So this one shows that there's a, can you see that red line? That's the line around the bishop's, that's the bishop's territory, I think, and that shows the whole thing. So that you need to know, if you're an administrator, how that map works. So when the hated abbot was finally driven out, at least for a time, and fled his castle, he had to beg the town for admission and protection. And that's when they let him enter, but they got the deal out of him. 30,000 gulden in exchange for complete freedom and control of their own affairs. And here's a picture of Gordian Zoiter, who did it. So next to the town hall, down low and facing well away from the bishop, but next to the main church, that's their town hall. And what they did was build their own council parlour, or the council pub, if you like, for the mayor and the council to drink in. And what they did was demolish the charnel house, which was the chapel of St. Erasmus, which had housed the bones of their ancestors. And they turned that into cellars for their wine stores. I think it's just a breathtaking example of a new attitude to death and a rejection of the mass cults and purgatory concerns of the old church. So we have largely forgotten the war over the past generation, but its traces are still here in the landscape. So what I'm trying to do is make the landscape itself present in the war, in the book that I'm writing. And I hope that I've convinced you that it is worth going back to a forgotten revolution, a moment of rupture, because now I think we really do need to understand about revolutions, about the inequality and spiritual transformation that can lead people to want to overturn their world. And I think that I'm starting to think afresh about what it is that we remember, how contested those memories often are, and how it is that people can, in a very short space of time, change some of their most profound values. And that's what I think a revolutionary moment is. It's a transformation not just of ideas, but of emotions, convictions, and spirituality. Thank you.
Lyndal, thank you so much for a fascinating and wonderfully illustrated, even from my angle, lecture. I'm enormously grateful to you. I get a little bit power mad on these occasions, but we will spread the microphone around, testing people's dexterity if we throw it. But this will allow anyone who asks a question to speak into what is actually a microphone. So that will allow, especially for those viewing remotely, everyone to hear what questions are. I would remind everybody that time is not infinite before we need to draw things to a conclusion. So please, one question per person, and not too many follow-ups, and certainly not speeches, thank you. Though I'm sure nobody present would indulge themselves that way. So, over to questions. Yeah. Somebody has to.
Okay, thank you so much for this. I wanted to ask you about the recent collective imagination of the Peasants' War. So I wonder what you think about this renaissance of seeing the Peasants' War as a political event that became quite formative for left-wing activists, especially in Germany and in Italy, mainly through the success of the novel Q that you might have read, which was a great success in Italy especially and in Germany. I don't know what here. But so it's been around, it's been a story, it's been something that was inspiration to people mainly on the left. What do you think about this?
That's a wonderful question. And that's been one of the most fascinating things for me working on this, because it's such a contested legacy. In the East, you've got Thomas Müntzer as the hero. In the West, I think in a parallel way, I'm becoming more and more convinced that what you have is a celebration of a vision of Germany as democratic. Memmingen presents itself as the formulation of the first document of human rights. So you have two different visions of the war, which are also different geographically. And I think that now it looks very different because Germany has been, since reunification, and since the other thing that happened in that earlier period was that people were trying to get away from Luther. And so they were concentrating very much more on how varied the Reformation was, how important Zwingli was, on understanding South German theology in its own terms. And so I think we had two parallel views of the Peasants' War, which are completely incompatible and which have to be brought back together. And I think that the idealization of it is absolutely fascinating. the kinds of things that people want to make memorials to, and just the range of them, the extraordinary ones to Münster in the east, some really tiny ones like naming of streets, and in the west, things like Dieter Klump, and these very aggressive, I mean, that's so pure 1980s sort of vintage, brutalist kind of concrete sculpture. It's wonderful. So it is very much something that has been very much of its time, not only in the East, which I think is one of the reasons why people have not wanted to go back to it, but in the West as well. And so I think there's a double thing to overcome.
Oh, gosh. Thanks, Mike. Pressure. Oh. Thanks so much, Lyndal. That was super fascinating. I've got so many questions, but I will stick to Mike's rule about only asking one. I wondered to what extent the process of forgetting sets in, perhaps in the 19th century. The town that I work on in Germany, I'm sure you know, Rothenburg ob der Tauber, they begin to sort of celebrate and remember their experience of the 30 Years' War in the 19th century, and they write plays and they get local people to dress up and dance and do all sorts of things. And I wonder if part of the amnesia about the Peasants' War is the fact that the council lost power, so it was a kind of a failure of lordship. And you mentioned how many local rulers, local councils, local nobles were embarrassed, ashamed by the power and size of the peasant army. So I wonder to what extent remembering, it was easier to remember some of the events of the 30 Years' War, the resistance to armies there. I wondered, you mentioned there are statues to some of the most vicious putters down of the revolt. So I wonder to what extent that kind of amnesia is to do with the failure of lordship on the part of so many of those local rulers.
Thank you. Yes, I think you're absolutely right. And what the point you made about the 30 Years' War is very, very interesting. And yet there's something else going on at the same time, which is an absolute flood of historical writing. Much more historical writing about the Peasants' War than about the Reformation, and of much higher quality at the time, because people really have to work out what happened. They have to justify what they did. But we don't have the account from the peasant side, and there's a wonderful, the sort of missing document, which would have been a history of the war by a guy called Simon Hoffmann, which he tried to publish at Nuremberg under the name Simon Schraudenbach, and it's disappeared. And that would have been the history from their point of view. But we don't have that. And instead, what we have are amazing historical writings from people who were in positions of where they really had to make decisions in the Peasants' War. So there's a fabulous one by Martin Korntal from Würzburg, which is a really moving and dramatic historical account. Then there's someone like Lorenz Fries, who writes not one history of the Peasants' War, but a 3-volume thing where he tries to make sense of it, first in terms of what happened, then he tries to trace every peasant army and tries to do a history that way, and then he does another one of every place to find out what happened in each place. So he's trying to have 3 different views on it. And you can see how he thought, because we have the cupboard where the documents were, so we can see his mental map and how he's using the documents to try and work with it. And he is one of our richest sources for the documents because he copies them all out. But he's not the only one doing that. There are scores of people doing this because they have to work out what happened and explain what they did. So it both gives rise to huge history writing at the time, which then can't be fitted into a longer narrative frame. And it gives rise to some straight-up monuments that celebrate victory over the peasants, but also many of these hidden ones, like the ones that Dürer does, that are very hard to make sense of. But not just that. Covers of pamphlets that don't make sense. There's one done by Burkmeyer. Why is he doing this? A really important artist. A 2-bit pamphlet, and he does a cover that is ambivalent and is not negative about the Peasants' War, and is prefacing a pamphlet which says too much punishment. Stop this punishment of the peasants. So you get a lot of anti-monuments, I think, and then I think it's the failure to make this, to know what to do with a trauma of this kind, and to just cope with that amount of mourning and defeat. I think that is very, very difficult. You can see that it comes out in religiosity like that you find amongst Anabaptists and other people after the war. So much is unsayable, and that's why I'm thinking of it as a donut event with this thing in the middle that is unspeakable, and which is to do with why it is that the peasants are not that keen on the Reformation afterwards. Of course they're not.
I'll try to be fair to the whole room, and that's going to test me.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. I wanted to go back to the point on the hatred of monasticism, and I immediately had to think about kind of and ask you about if you had looked at the cultural depictions of monks around the era, and I couldn't help but think about these popular song collections printed in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the most famous of which are probably Georg Forster's Frische Deutsche Liedlein in Nuremberg and the Antwerp Songbook, and look at how, while the negative depictions of monks in Latin were common throughout the Middle Ages, there is kind of an explosion of vernacular songs that are kind of satirizing like monkly behavior, such as like usury or overindulging in food and wealth. So I wanted to hear your thought about how you'd integrate that kind of view into the motives of the peasants' revolt, and how you might be able to use these sources to contextualize the side of the peasants which we don't really get to see.
Thank you. Thank you. You're absolutely right that anti-monasticism is a common cultural trope. But what I think is really interesting is the intensity of it at this point, and what that issues in terms of action and destruction. What the peasants do is deeply, deeply shocking. When you consider that the chalice wouldn't have been visible even, probably, or only in the distance, and then to pick it up and take it home, that's a huge transformation of very deep cultural taboos. We read about people doing what we've just been doing, throwing around sacred objects. Then I think what's also going on at this time is a collapse in monastic vocations and people leaving monasteries and getting married. So that many of these monasteries are extremely exposed because they now don't have that many monks in them, and they're centres of wealth. So it's clear that they can't really defend themselves, and it's also clear that there's an issue about their wealth in relation to the numbers. So I think that's a crisis of monasticism that is much more than anti-monastic tropes that are certainly circulating in the culture and that are part of what make this possible. It's just that it's one thing to laugh at monks. I think it's another to actually go into their cells, throw monks out of windows, attack them physically, take stuff away, and then set the whole thing on fire. That's a different level of hatred, and it goes along with a religious shift in which instead of fasting, control of resources, control of time, and doing devotional works, once you no longer value that, part of what is driving this movement is that it's a time of jubilee. It's a time where you all go together, you all march together, you're marching to the beat of a drum, and you're having barbecues, you're stuffing yourself with meat, and very often it's the monastic livestock herds that they're going for. They're going for sheep, they're barbecuing sheep or cooking it when the sheep are in full wool. That is just a sinful waste of wool. And that's what they're doing. And that is just a very different understanding of brotherhood. This is not monastic brotherhood. This is not renunciation brotherhood. This is living it up brotherhood. Brotherhood is a mass movement.
I'd love to ask you whether eating meat in Lent, because it starts before Lent, but I don't. I want to talk about something else. You've given us a really graphic account of the looting and startling examples of iconoclasm and sacrilege. Could you say a bit more about the what you just hinted at, the physical assaults on religious, and particularly whether that's gendered? I mean, do they treat monks and nuns differently, or is the levels of personal violence pretty much depends really much on which group it is? So what's the pattern of personal violence in the context of this massive attack on property and wealth?
That's a great question, and we tried to find out about that. And I think we would probably say that the patterns are not really clear because there's not a big difference in the proportion of convents and monasteries that are attacked. It's round about 30%. Slightly higher, though, in the case of convents, which is not what we expected. And the level of hatred, certainly verbally, seems to be very high. What you get with convents is a lot of implicit fear about rape. And sometimes that's directly mentioned, sometimes it's indirect. But very few cases in which that actually happened, as far as we can tell. Sometimes they use turns of phrase which suggest that something may have happened, but not in particular in relation to convents, in relation to women in general. They say things happened to them which were shameful. So the level of personal violence, the use of the Herrenstrick, that is clearly sexual and humiliating and painful. Otherwise, to begin with, it often is very good-humoured. It's about moving into the monastery, having a good time, teasing the monks, and basically drinking and eating their stuff. And there are cases where you get peasant leaders actually saying that they don't want a monastery to be burnt to the ground. And I think that happens at Maulbronn. And the reason is that the building is beautiful, which is really interesting. But clearly, there's also an assumption that that's what is going to happen. And it's really important because if the monastery as a building goes, the landscape really looks different. So I'd say you can't say it's more convents than monasteries. You can say it's slightly more, but not a whole lot more. And probably the key issue is how those institutions are perceived. Are they perceived as rich and exploitative, or are they perceived as ones that are not exploitative? And I think that's why not all of them are attacked. It's just as interesting those ones which are not. And quite often they are ones in towns where there is another focus. So part of what's going on is you don't attack that monastery because you're attacking the other one where you're going to get more.
We've probably got time for one more, and I'm conscious that this side of the room hasn't really had much of a deal.
And there's someone here. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And my question is related to what you said about how it's difficult to reconstruct what they exactly thought. And I was wondering if that was possibly linkable to an aspect of radical theology, especially Münzer, which almost becomes conscious of the limited potential of the word to precisely convey the divine message. So quite in opposition to mainstream Protestantism, I would say.
I think that's really, really important, and that's why I've tried in writing about this never to talk about ideology or to talk as if Münzer has the ideas, because I think really important to it is actually, one of the dimensions of this is actually dreams. Dreams are hugely important, and Münzer makes great use of dreams. Some of his followers dream, and it's said that he based his sermons on those dreams. But that's not the only example of dreams. Dreams come up in a whole host of different contexts. People have dreams about, there's one where someone dreams of a black heart and then of nobles being chased away like mice. There are, I think that part of what happens with the Peasants' War and part of what happens with any event like this is it isn't that people get new ideas so much as that they, a part of their perception, you might say they're unconscious perhaps, their sense of possibility is opened up in a new way. And I think that's, that comes through the experience of doing things that you've never done before. And that's how people change over the course of even just a few weeks. And I think you're absolutely right. It's not just, it isn't about words. It's about experience, imagination, and a sense of what might be possible that people can't necessarily put into words, but is to do with experience. And so I guess that's what I've tried to convey as a different way of thinking about revolt and revolution. Thank you. That was a great question.
So this is where I have to apologise for those that I've not turned to with questions, but the clock is against us and we do need to be humane to our speakers and not subject them to endless questioning. It just remains for me to thank you very much, Lyndal, for a fascinating insight that's reminded us about how we think about the past and to be more self-conscious sometimes about the ways in which historians and everyone else think about the past and how we memorialise as well. And I've been absolutely fascinated to look at this insight you've given us into one of those liminal moments where new possibilities do open up, some of which then close, some of which then, as with the denuding of monastic wealth, must have lingered with a long-term shift, with the municipalities not least. And it's absolutely fascinating to look at that and then to start to think about other periods, other places that have experienced similar moments. And you've given us new ways of looking and thinking at those other places and those other moments. So we thank you very much indeed.